is prioritized. Therein lies the key factor right there, because you can have a wish list. If I wish this university did this, I wish it did that, I wish it did that. But when push comes to shove and money gets involved in this, because of course universities need money to do the things that they do, as many different groups do, what matters most? Well, you need to be doing your primary job first. Primary job first. And your primary job, pursuit of the truth, excellent research, good students, good teaching, and good students. I started 2026 here by looking back a little bit at 2025 in the last video to have a peek at what my universities have started doing, what happened with universities with respect to the Trump administration, and some of the things that universities have or haven't done to make some changes to improve upon the legitimate complaints that there are, and others that are screaming at the wind about those complaints being made at all, given certain circumstances with the Trump administration and the like. But of course, we come to the question of, what do Americans really want? As much as folks may want it to be otherwise, of course, universities, higher education doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists as part of society. And it is, as I've said many times, where we train the next generation of scientists. So it can't be ignored. It has to be addressed when there's problems. It has to be considered. What do Americans really want to see out of their universities in particular? And so this piece from Free the Inquiry, which is a great Substack you should be following, Americans overwhelmingly agree on what universities should focus on when values conflict. The public prioritizes academic excellence. This caught my attention. Now, I do want to there's a few things I'm going to point out with it that are interesting here that perhaps don't agree with other things that have been said elsewhere or other survey results. So let us begin here. Hold on, let me get rid of that. From congressional hearings to donor revolts to headlines about campus protests, American universities are being told loudly that they've lost the public's trust. But beneath the noise, there's a quieter question that rarely gets asked. When Americans criticize universities, what do they actually want them to do instead? This is why I like this, because I've noticed this so many times with the age that we live in, that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of people asking the deeper fundamental question. Like, for example, one of the things that has gotten lost is the question of, what is the proper role of higher education in society? What is the proper role of science in society? Those kinds of things are not necessarily being asked or answered in this day and age. This is another good one. There's lots of information about out there to say that Americans are not necessarily thrilled with U.S. higher education. But of course, the question is, what do folks actually want? And so a new study published in Science Advances, as they go on to say here, by economists at Cornell and the University of Regensburg, examines what societal roles Americans believe universities should engage in beyond their core mission of education and research, i.e. the pursuit of the truth. Yeah. The researchers first surveyed a representative sample of over 2,000 citizens, U.S. citizens, to understand whether, in their opinion, universities should engage in several initiatives beyond their core mission, which is to conduct cutting-edge research and educate students. Across a range of initiatives, participants indicated that universities should definitely or probably should not, to probably or definitely should, engage in DEI, environmental sustainability, political engagement, speech and expression policies, traditional values, health and well-being programs, global perspectives, free speech and open dialogue, and patriotism and veterans initiatives. Now, when you're reading that, here's a thing to keep in mind, and this is a critique I have of the survey. Now, I will admit I haven't read the actual paper yet. I do want to go back and read that, and what I may do is I may read the paper and then come back later with a follow-on video to this one. So, like, one of the things here that's interesting is you have speech and expression policies and you have free speech and open dialogue. Now, why are those two things both in there? Was that first thing, the speech and expression policies, meant to be engaged in creating policies that restrict speech? Don't know. Likewise, traditional values, okay. For a lot of folks, that's not necessarily clear what is meant by that. And global perspectives, again, I don't honestly know what in the world is meant by that when I just look at this. So this is a beef I have with a lot of survey kind of things, where there's these sort of nebulous things in here that don't necessarily give a very clear and specific definition of what the authors of the survey are referring to and trying to measure public opinion about. And so it is a very, it's very finicky and annoying to me to see some of these kinds of things in here. So that's just a point I wanted to make here with that before we continue. The results offer clarity on public expectations for higher education. On average, across political and demographic groups, respondents agree that universities probably or definitely should support a variety of social initiatives beyond their core mission. Most strongly, health and well-being, global perspectives, and free speech and open dialogue. Again, what the heck are those latter two, and what the heck is this? The only area in which the average respondent did not support university engagement was politics. This result tracks with several 2025 public polls in which people said political engagement and political bias are current issues within universities. Yeah, there's plenty of that out there that I'm not going to rehash it right now. Despite this general agreement among respondents, the findings also reveal a conflicting set of expectations for what universities should engage in beyond a primary goal of academic excellence. Overall, respondents supported universities engaging in initiatives like DEI. Stuff like that I question, given recent history, but that's a whole other thing. Regulating speech and expression. Again, if this thing, speech and expression policies, is regulating free speech and expression, was this really explained that that's what that speech and expression policies was referring to? I question that. I have lots of questions about how these kinds of surveys are done and whether or not such things that are as vague as that mean to the respondents what the authors of the survey think it means to them. So that's a whole thing right there. Advocating patriotism and traditional values, commitments that seem to contradict and a simultaneous support for free speech and open dialogue, opposition to political engagement. Some of these, like the DEI thing in particular, I have seen surveys quite to the opposite. Quite to the opposite, where there's more on the other side of the line here. So I again, there's some contradictory things there compared to other surveys that are out there. Or at least I think I've seen that. I've seen something similar to that. It might not be DEI explicitly, but I do recall seeing something explicit to that, similar to that, and maybe I'll have to dig it up and find it. And if I can't find it, then it proves that, well, that wasn't quite what I was thinking it was whenever I saw it. So I'll have to go dig that up just to make sure I satisfy curiosity here when I get the chance. But again, like, this somewhat makes sense. This vague, very vague. And so I question whether or not the survey respondents had the same interpretation of that statement as did the authors of the survey. That's the question mark that I have. If this was what was asked to respond to in the survey, what was the respondent? The other thing I would want to note here is that these dots here, you can barely see them, but they do have whiskers with them, which is to indicate the confidence there. I am quite perplexed at why the authors of the study used one standard error or one standard deviation, because if you're doing it from statistics, the side thing there, one standard deviation corresponds to about 67% confidence, if I recall correctly, and I'm going to take a hot second and check that. So yes, I was approximately correct. 68%. One standard error around something is roughly 68% confidence under the empirical rule of statistics. I had to go check real quick to make sure I had the number right for folks. And that's typically kind of weird, actually, because most of the time when you see confidence intervals reported, it's a 95% confidence interval, which is closer to two standard deviations or standard errors on either side of the value. And so, uh, weird, squirrely things. It's not necessarily bad, it's just weird to me to see that. So, it's a question mark that I have. Why one standard error over two? Free speech and open dialogue may require permitting a wide range of ideas to be expressed, including those that others may find objectionable. Yet speech and expression policies generally exist to limit expression in service of other goals, narrowing the range of permissible speech on campus. I go back to my initial question. That speech and expression policies thing, is it what you think it is? Because the other way, speech and expression policies, the other way somebody could interpret just that general statement is a policy that allows free speech, is something like an institutional neutrality statement or the Chicago principles or any number of different things. Those are those would have very negative and very positive connotations, negative in terms of the, restrictions, and positive in terms of allowing more speech, but they're both free speech and they're both speech and expression policies. So again, survey thing here, was were the respondents having the same interpretation of that phrase speech and expression policies that the rest of the world, that the creators of the survey were having? Serious question. With limited exceptions, such as limitations on time, place, and manner of speech to protect university operations, both cannot coherently be supported at once. Well, that's the reason why I said what I said here, is because if the interpretation is that speech and expression policies are those promoting free speech, then those two things can coherently be supported at the same time. If not, then no, of course they can't. But my guess is it was so vague in the survey that nobody really knows what the respondents were thinking when they responded to that. And so it makes it sort of moot when I look at some of these things. A similar incoherence appears in respondent support for both DEI initiatives and traditional values. DEI programs are typically justified in terms of equity, group representation, and outcome-based measures, while traditional American values emphasize merit and equal treatment under the law. Thank you. And yes, that statement is true, but again, traditional values being in there. Are you sure all your respondents have the same understanding of what is meant by traditional values? Like, to me, that means merit and equal treatment under the law, at least partially, alongside the traditions of free speech and debate and what have you. But anyway, liberals and conservatives significantly differ in what they want universities to engage in. See, I can understand the ease of using this. Really, I do. At the same time, there was a great study not too long ago that looked at the variability of thought on traditional left versus traditional right, and the variability of thought on the more right-leaning side of the spectrum, center right and beyond, in particular, and even some just straight up center, much more variable opinions, much more variable and diverse opinions than on the left and the far left. And I do believe actually some liberals might be now counted as amongst center and right because of some of the crazier stuff going on. So liberals in this study were quite supportive of universities engaging in DEI and environmental sustainability initiatives and opposed engagement in patriotism, while conservatives on average thought that universities should engage in patriotism and traditional values while they opposed engagement in DEI. The overall opposition to political engagement was primarily driven by conservatives and those without college degrees. So yeah, college versus no college in here. This is the wide-ranging things in here. Now we come to the interesting part about this, because when push comes to shove, money's involved for a lot of these things at the universities. People pay people and pay for equipment and things like that to be able to do any of those things that are identified above. Nonetheless, despite these partisan differences, respondents on average agreed that universities should engage in both sets of contradictory priorities. Again, I don't necessarily agree with that, particularly on the free speech versus policies one. That actually doesn't make sense. This means that at least a portion of respondents who opposed political engagement still favored universities promoting other contested social ideals. The result is not polarization between two clear models of the university, but accumulation, a general expectation that universities should advance nearly every social value to some degree. At a practical level, this puts decision makers within universities in a difficult position if they are trying in good faith to reflect public desires. Despite this, the study provides some cause for optimism through its insight into respondents' priorities. In an allocation exercise, respondents were asked to make a series of funding decisions among competing universities. They were shown matchups, with each comparing two real world but anonymized universities, and were asked to divide $30 between the two. Participants were informed that universities had similar financial resources but differed in ranking across four dimensions: academic performance, free speech, environmental sustainability, and DEI. Across political and demographic groups, academic excellence had the strongest and most stable effect on respondents' funding decisions, outweighing every other consideration, with participants allocating $3 more on average to institutions ranking high on academic performance. High rankings on free speech and environmental sustainability also increased allocations, though by a smaller margin. By contrast, DEI was prioritized last by respondents overall, with notable differences among groups. Women and liberals allocated more money to universities with high DEI rankings, whereas men and conservatives penalized universities with high DEI rankings. These results show that when forced to choose between competing roles for a university as reality demands, academic performance is prioritized. Therein lies the key factor right there, because you can have a wish list. If I wish this university did this, I wish it did that, I wish it did that. But when push comes to shove and money gets involved in this, because of course universities need money to do the things that they do, as many different groups do, what matters most? Well, you need to be doing your primary job first. Primary job first. And your primary job: pursuit of the truth, excellent research, good students. Good teaching and good students. Those are the primary things here that matter. Again, it's only one standard error, though, so I would love to see this spread out a little bit more. And I would have loved to see some statistical significance tests, but maybe it's in the paper and it's just not shown here, but that would be my thing. If academic excellence is what Americans ultimately care most about, as this study suggests, then the task for those focused on university reform is to explain that universities cannot institutionalize every social goal without sacrificing their core mission: producing and distributing knowledge. And one would argue, what is the purpose of the university? Is the purpose of the university all those other social goals, or is it something else? Go back to that. What is the purpose of a university? If Americans already agree on that priority, then if we can help them understand that they must decide between conflicting values, they will decide in favor of the pursuit of academic knowledge. For HXA, this means continuing to explain that DEI-driven hiring, admissions, and promotion advances demographic diversity at the cost of viewpoint diversity. It means continuing to explain that a commitment to patriotism or any particular set of social values results in selecting for ideological alignment over research quality. It means continuing to explain that open inquiry, not illiberal restrictions on speech, are a requirement for a free exchange of ideas. The study suggests that HXA and other aligned advocates are succeeding in this pursuit. Our advocacy for institutional neutrality, for example, aligns with the study's finding that Americans oppose university political engagement. Universities today operate as though the public demands that they teach, research, regulate speech, advance equity, and embody competing cultural ideals all at once. This study suggests that when confronted with the central truth of economics, that resources are limited, what people actually want from most universities is something more limited yet more demanding: institutions that are excellent at producing knowledge and committed to the conditions that make that possible. So that's my take on the survey, but I question some of the results of the survey because, again, I think some of the stuff was so vague in there that, did the respondents have the same interpretation of that as the authors of the survey were expecting? I'm not so sure. But overall, this is something to keep in serious mind for anybody who's working at a university, running at a university, because you do have to live in the larger body of society here as a university, and you can't just ignore what the public in general wants and what they expect out of a university system. Or at least that's my take on it. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrienne. May you stay curious.